You want more, Kate?
It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood, a beautiful day for a neighbor. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? It's a neighborly day in this beautywood, a neighborly day for beauty. Would you be mine? Could you be mine? I have always wanted to have a neighbor just like you. I've always wanted to live in a neighborhood with you, so let's make the most of this beautiful day. Since we're together, we might as well say, would you be mine? Would you be mine? Won't you be my neighbor? Won't you please? Won't you please? Please won't you be my neighbor? Hey neighbor, you know what these are? They're suitcases. But I'm not going away. No, I'm using them to carry things.
I actually saw a number of you singing the song
I know.
along.
That was my kids.
The sermon's titled The Least of These, and in case you're wondering if it's going to be a sermon that says, here's the way you're supposed to treat other people, and if you don't, you get in trouble, like our Old Testament reading said. That's not what we're getting. As usual with Jesus, there's a flip side to this if we dig a little bit deeper, and it comes back at us like a boomerang as we explore this a little bit deeper. I love how at the end, Fred Rogers says, did you notice this? He says these are suitcases. He says, no, but I'm not going away. Mr. Rogers always did stuff to make us feel comfortable as children. I think for me as an adult, everything was a routine. It was slowing things down. He actually had children sit still as he put an egg timer on 1 minute, and they just sat there. His production assistant said everything that makes for good TV, all the theatrical stuff and the high-tech sets and everything, throw it all out the window, and there you have Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. There was a little girl one time, and her parents wrote Mr. Rogers a letter. And she told Mr. Rogers, she says, I'm concerned. She was worried that the fish weren't getting fed every day. Do y'all remember feeding the fish? Some days he said, feed the fish. Other days he just fed the fish. And she was worried that the fish weren't getting fed. Turns out the little girl was blind. And when Mr. Rogers heard this, he made sure every day for that little girl to tell her that he was feeding the fish. This is the first of a series that I want to do on Mr. Rogers' theology, and I'm not trying to make him into something that he's not. He was a human being. His wife said sometimes he had a bad temper. To take out his anger, he would go swim laps. So he wasn't truly a saint, I guess as we would call it, but he was a hero. At least he's a hero of mine. I think it's interesting the heroes that we have at different stages of our lives. When I was a young man, getting out of college, going into the Navy, in the intelligence community, my heroes were sort of, I don't know, CIA director, people high up in the intelligence community, foreign service people, government people, I guess. I also flirted with this little Top Gun thing, you know. I was like, I really want to be a fighter pilot. And then they gave me those tests where you have like a cog wheel, and it's turning this way, so this one's turning this way, and you have to be able to tell which way this way. Have you ever taken one of those tests? Yeah, they said forget it. No way. That's why I can't put together things. It's why I tried to assemble my bed frame, and it took me 3 tries. I had to take it apart. But those were my heroes. And now as I've been through more of life experience, more of a transformational time in my life, Fred Rogers is one of my biggest heroes. I've noticed that, Fred had an interesting life. Fred, as he was growing up, was called Fat Freddy. And you doing all right, Daniel?
Yes.
What's going on?
I'm just going to have a seat over here.
Was called Fat Freddy. And he used to get chased by kids in the neighborhood. And so they would chase him. From school, and he would run to a neighbor's house, and she would open the door, and she would let him in. And Daniel, you're making me nervous over there.
I know these people.
Who do you know?
Her.
Okay.
I've seen them all.
Okay. All right.
I appreciate it.
Okay. I apologize then. He was called Fat Freddy. He went to seminary and became a PCUSA minister, as a matter of fact. And maybe that's one of the reasons why I really like Freddie, why I like Fred. Fred could empathize with people who were the least of these. And I'm reading a book. Kate, give me one more. By Amy Hollingsworth. It's a quote from Fred. I have friends in this world I call minimal. And I start to examine my feelings about Fred Rogers. And I've noticed something interesting. Whenever I watch Mr. Rogers' documentaries or movies, I start crying. I'm not sure why. In my counseling degree and everything, I'm taught to examine my feelings. I'm taught to help other people examine their feelings. And I start to examine this. What is it about Mr. Rogers that makes me tear up and start crying? I started thinking about it as I examined my own feelings on this. Maybe it's because I used to watch Mr. Rogers with my sister, and it was a simpler time in life. A time when I could be reassured by Mr. Rogers that everything was okay. Every day was a routine. And as I get to know you all a little better and I'm willing to share a little bit more, it could be also because that half hour a day was maybe sometimes a time that was less chaotic in my home as a child, as I look back. My mother was one of the least of these. She suffered from clinical depression and I think was manically depressed. This was back before we had medication that could sort of tweak the chemical balances in your brain. And there were times in our house when Mr. Rogers, as I look back, I think was probably a source of some comfort and stability until my dad would get home. And my dad would get home and try to sort of smooth things out. But we could tell when this was coming on. There would be the 2 o'clock in the morning furious typing at the kitchen counter on some junior league project on child advocacy or something. And then there would be angry outbursts and things like that. And I think Mr. Rogers took me back to a time, maybe when things were simpler. What do we make of this thing from Jesus where he says, you can't, unless you become a child again, you cannot enter the kingdom of heaven? It sounds kind of crazy, doesn't it? It sounds kind of scary. But the kingdom of heaven is actually here. And I think the kingdom of heaven, we can't enter the kingdom of heaven until we connect with our feelings and we can become empathetic towards other people, which enables us to be compassionate towards other people, which enables us to see them for who they really are, which enables us to love them. I was talking with Marta yesterday, because we always talk about my sermons, and we were both shocked. Do you know that this passage in Matthew is not in the Revised Common Lectionary? Over 3 years, it's not deemed worthy to preach a sermon on. And we were both shocked by that, because this is one of the most transformational passages in Scripture. But maybe it's a little scary, but maybe we read it on a surface level. Let's kind of dig into this just a little bit. Marta reminded me as I started my own spiritual journey, I don't know, I was probably about 40 before I got serious about God. And the way I started was I prayed for wisdom. And then I was willing to let God teach me. But that was my prayer. My prayer was for wisdom. And it's taken me a lifetime, and it's something that still is taking me a lifetime. This is the work of a lifetime. It's brick by brick. I remember in 2007, I had just gone to Washington, D.C. as a naval officer. I was meeting a friend of mine, Clay Torbert, down at a restaurant in Georgetown called Paolo's. And I was walking down the street. It was kind of late afternoon, early evening. And I saw this homeless man up in front of me. And he was asking people for money. And sure enough, I started to get nervous. I started to get a little anxious. And unlike everybody else, he stood up and started following me. And he wasn't threatening me, but he made me angry. And of course, back then, I really didn't have the capacity to try to process my feelings because I was disconnected from my feelings. But as I look back at it now, what was it about this man that made me angry? He wanted money and I didn't give it to him. I'm not proud to say that. And I'm not saying you should give money to every single person that asks you. But I was able to justify it in my own mind by saying, you know, he probably wanted it for drugs. Right? He was going to buy alcohol with it. What was it about him that made me angry? 10 years later, Martin and I were transferring to Washington, D.C., and we were at a Longhorn Steakhouse. And this was, I'd been in seminary for about 3 years. I was doing clinical pastoral education, and I was starting to process my feelings. Mr. Rogers talks about processing feelings a lot. How does this make you feel?
We wrote because Jeff was going to have a spinal fusion and be in they call it halo, metal rim, and then cast on his shoulders and bolted
all the way down his trunk.
Yeah.
We
He
went
did not
through-
survive the surgery. And so we said, you know, what would you like to do? This is going to be a really big task for you, and so we want to kick it off with something that'd be really special.
Mr. Rogers?
Hey, Jeff. I'm glad to see you. Thank you very much for coming by. Can you tell my friends what it is that made you need this wheelchair?
Sure. Well, when I was about 7 months old, I had a tumor, and it broke the nerves to tell my hands and legs what to do.
I see.
And I got a wheelchair when I was 4 years old.
That was your first one when you were 4.
Uh-huh.
He told Jeff before they started that they would have a chat and then sing a song together.
I think he said we might sing something. So, I mean, I was sort of surprised. What, he was gonna start singing a song, you know, there's just totally, not even what song.
It's you I like. It's not the things you wear. It's not the way you do your hair. But it's you I like. The way you are right now. The way down deep inside you. Not the things that not your fancy chair. That's just beside you. But it's you I like. Every part of you. Your skin, your eyes, your feeling, whether old or new. I hope that you remember, even when you're feeling blue, that it's you I like, it's you yourself, it's you. It's you I like. It is you I like, Jeff. And there must be times when you do feel blue. I'm not feeling blue right now, though.
Me neither.
I'm so glad that you came today.
Thanks.
I remember asking one of the staff people that was there, well, you know, what do you think? Did it? You go, okay, don't, this is good, this is good.
He had his surgery, he survived. Certainly Mr. Rogers had an impact on who Jeff became, his sense of self.
Pretty amazing, huh? This sermon could have been entitled, I think, Who Saves Who? Or course, who saves whom. It's really we save each other, isn't it? Fred saves little Jeff by showing him kindness as one of the least of these. But Fred also opens himself up to his feelings and becomes vulnerable to Jeff, allowing Jeff to save him as well. I started a story. We were moving to Washington, D.C. We were living in a hotel, and we went to a Longhorn Steakhouse, Laura and I. And there was a woman sitting sort of in the bar area, and she looked like maybe she was homeless. Her clothes were very dirty. And she was sort of manically counting $1 bills. And she was trying to flag down the waitress, and she was exhibiting signs that I felt were probably signs maybe of schizophrenia. She was doing this and other things. And something made me just get up. And I walked over to her table. She was being ignored by the waiter, ignored by the bar staff. She was trying to order something to drink. And I just walked up and introduced myself. I have no idea why. I just felt like I ought to do that. And she got up and she gave me a hug. And she smelled really bad. And she was mentally ill. But there was something about her embrace that touched me very deeply. And she told me that you look at me like I'm a person. You see me. This is the work of a lifetime. I'm still trying to learn it, and I'm ashamed to say that I don't always do this. This was one instance where I did. And the waitstaff continued to ignore her. Finally, they came up and they kicked her out. They picked her up and they were starting to push her towards the door. And she came by my table and she just reached out and she touched me on the way out. And Marta and I were just sitting there going, oh my gosh. We finished our dinner, we walked outside, and she was waiting for us. And she came up and gave me a great big hug. And she said, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. We got into the car, and Marta just sat there and cried. I wasn't ready to turn the engine on, and I just sat there in awe. And what was I feeling? I was feeling gratitude. This woman had touched me and felt like the touch of an angel. And in return, she was gratified by my looking at her and us being willing to recognize that she is a human being and a child of God as well. Who saves who? Who's the least of these in this situation? I would argue, outside the restaurant in Georgetown, the homeless man who had no money, who got up and walked along beside me, non-threatening, non-nothing, was trying to help save me, whether he knew it or not. And I was the least of these in that situation, in my nice blazer and khaki pants and expensive shoes, and I was the least of these. Outside Longhorn, I was still probably the least of these, but at least I was starting to get a clue. Allowing someone to save me as I was trying to save them. We have one more, okay? I think as Fred would say, the least of these is feeling for other human beings and seeing them as human beings and as children of God. And again, this is a different message depending on who we are. If you're the woman who has schizophrenia and is being kicked out of Longhorn, this message resonates with you in a different way than me offering the hug, perhaps. What's my next slide? Okay, hang on just a minute. As I start to wrap up, who saves who? And I'm going to let Fred wrap up for us today. Look at the look on Fred Rogers' face. This is him being inducted into the Television Hall of Fame. You can't fake this. Look at the look on his face when Jeff in the wheelchair comes out, now many years later. And his face just glows. And he jumps out of his seat. I won't spoil it. You can't fake that. Fred called fame a four-letter word because he said it puts blinders on us. Fame, money, security put blinders on us and keep us from tapping into our feelings and expressing our vulnerability to other people who may be considered the least of these by society, but who really are a lot closer to God than many of us. Fred is willing to become a child again. I'm trying to learn how to become a child again. And it's like I said, it's the work of a lifetime. As I wrap it up, maybe that's why we come to church still. Maybe it's why we get up in the morning and we zip up a skirt or we put our foot through a pair of pants. It's because we're trying to learn this message. We're trying to live this message. How do we become a child again? How do we save others? And how do we become vulnerable enough to let others save us? Because surely none of us saves ourselves.
Please welcome Jeffrey Erlenberg.
It's an honor to be here tonight, to be part of your this proud moment. You know, when you tell people that it's your life, you know that you really mean it. And tonight, I want to let you know that on behalf of millions of children and grown-ups, it is you